Okay, everybody, let's get started. Welcome. I am Stephen Pedigo, the director of the LBJ Urban Lab and faculty member here at the school. I'm super excited to have Pittsburgh Mayor Bill Peduto join us today for a conversation about his cities, his policies, and hopefully some good advice for future policymakers, Mayor. I think that's one of the things that we're hoping to dive in at the end of today's conversation. Um, the LBJ Schools has a proud legacy of welcoming mayors every year to our school. In the past, we've had Mayor Landrieu from New Orleans, Chicago's mayor, Mayor Manuel, Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan right before the pandemic, and you, Mayor. We didn't have a mayor last year, unfortunately, because things were a little hairy, I guess one could say, across the country. But it's good to have you with us here for today's conversation. So welcome.
Thank you. It's really great to be joining you as well.
So here's how we'll work today's conversation for those that are joining us. We'll do about 30 to 35 minutes of a sort of a moderated Q&A. I've got some questions for the mayor, and hopefully it'll get both spark interest with our audience members as well. And then we'll leave the last 15 minutes for students and faculty and our LBJ stakeholders to ask some questions with you. So Mayor, maybe we'll do this. Maybe we'll just skip all the bio stuff. I'd love for you to, very impressive bio, obviously. But maybe we just start with your personal story a bit, and that is, how did you end up as mayor of Pittsburgh?
I would say that I'm the person that shouldn't have been mayor. I had no background in politics. My mom was the first person born in this country and her family. Her parents were immigrants who came over after the First War. My grandfather had a second grade education. He spent his life working in a steel mill. My grandmother had no education. She was illiterate. And they raised their family. And my father was a school teacher who went into sales. And then before he passed away, went back into teaching history. And my mom raised four boys, and there was no politics in our family. There was never a time we had a yard sign in our yard or were committee members or went to political fundraisers. I just was bitten in the second grade, quite honestly, but with a love of history and a very strong interest in government. And went through that period of life. And after college and working on campaigns, continued to work on campaigns, and went to work in city government, and then went to work in the Beltway, and came back home to Pittsburgh, started my own consulting firm at the very earliest ages of the use of a computer. Did a lot of micro-targeting work and campaign work. Began a campaign consulting firm. Got sick of that by my early 30s, and took a pay cut of 1/2 to become a chief of staff to a city council member. When that council member decided not to run, I ran for city council, ran and successfully won 3 terms, 12 years on council, and learned quite a bit about city government. Ran for mayor and lost, and ran again and won, and served 2 terms as the mayor of the city of Pittsburgh, and ending my second term this year, and will be phasing out of elected service at the end of this year.
Very cool. And talk to us a little bit about your relationship with Pittsburgh. Obviously, this is a city, as even as you were city council member and mayor, that's went through some significant economic transformations. I think, as you may have known, I was a graduate student in Pittsburgh for many years at Carnegie Mellon.
Yep.
And love that city. And for those that are maybe not familiar with Pittsburgh, perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about that economic transformation. And if you could point to maybe 2 or 3 moments, you would say, this is really where things started to change for a city that was, frankly, a Rust Belt city and was seeing a decline in all kinds of things, from employment to population. What's been the catalyst for that transformation in your city?
Well, I would point, My childhood, which was magical. Growing up in Pittsburgh in the 1970s, you had the Steelers, obviously, and 4 Super Bowls, and the Pirates and 2 World Series. It's been quite a while since we've seen one of those. The University of Pittsburgh and the NCAA championship, and all locked into that one decade. And the economy was booming. Pittsburgh in the 1970s was the third largest corporate center in the United States. It was New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh for the most Fortune 100 and 500 companies in the United States. And then we were still living off of the wealth of the Gilded Age. So, I mean, it was quite an era to grow up in. And then came 1979. And I mean, 79, the Pirates won the World Series with We Are Family and Willie Stargell, and the Steelers won their 4th Super Bowl in 6 years, and the city died. I mean, we literally died. We lost more people in the next several years than New Orleans lost after Katrina. Our unemployment was at 20%. It was greater than during the Great Depression. And our city's deficit rose to a rate that was greater than New York City's when they went bankrupt. I mean, the city during the 1980s had an economic crash that is unparalleled in American history. And we went through an economic depression that knocked us to our knees as the steel industry and all the ancillary industries just were torn out from underneath us. You couldn't find a job here. And not only that, the families that tried to stay here lost their homes. And in fact, still in the city government, our government, our city is the biggest real estate agent in the city. I have 15,000 properties because of that era, because property had no value. So when grandma passed away, people would come back, take the TV, take the couch, and leave the keys with the city. And all during the 80s and the 90s, we had to reinvent ourselves. Tracts of land, entire neighborhoods were vacant. And as we went through that period, we looked back and we thought, well, maybe we can rebuild it as to what it was. And every political ad always showed the politician with the hard hat on and how we're going to bring back the mills and how we're going to bring back big steel. And, it was always this message of, we're going to be able to do it. But at that same time, there were those that were planting seeds, and they were saying that, yeah, we can be faithful to who we are and who we were, but there's all these different things happening right around us, and maybe they have an ability to take off. It was on Carnegie Mellon's campus that the idea of artificial intelligence was being born by a guy named Herb Simon, who was working through the psychology department, not through the computer sciences, but through the psychology department, and then being born through the computer science department and building it out. And a robotics department that was being built in the first robotics departments in the world and offering the first PhD in robotics. And it was down the street from CMU that the life sciences were being created, and through grant programs through the federal government, a small University of Pittsburgh medical center that was basically taking off from a medical psychological center that was being born and recreated. And through those eds and meds, new industries were being born in Pittsburgh. And through the overnight success story of Pittsburgh that took over 30 years. New industries were born, and
Yeah.
that's really how the transformation came. It was organic. It
Yeah.
wasn't planned. It didn't come through corporations or others. It came really through the talent that was here, through the faculty and the staff, and more so a story of how the mountain moved to Muhammad and not how, or I'm sorry, how, yeah, the mountain moved to Muhammad and not
Yeah.
how Muhammad moved to the mountain.
So it's fair to say, I mean, a lot of the press sort of paints the transformation of Pittsburgh as sort of an overnight phenomenon, right? If you look at it today.
Yeah.
And what you're describing to our students and faculty and staff and folks that are joining us today is that, and this is something that we talk a lot about in my urban development class here at the policy school, is that economic transformation is generational. It takes time. And it seems to me that the thing that you're pointing to as one of the catalysts there was that your city was able to really harness its great institutions, its meds and eds, University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, and others, and that continues to kind of be the platform, which is really maybe driving continuing to push this transformation forward, perhaps.
I think that, when you look at the challenges of today, and there are some severe challenges of today, the biggest is that we have become hardwired to binary decision making, right?
Right.
So if I use one of these and it's an Apple, then I don't like Samsung. And if I drive a Chevy, I don't like Ford. And it's everything is, if I like one thing, I don't like the other, all the way to politics. That is the antithesis of what the Pittsburgh story was. The Pittsburgh story was we got knocked down to our knees so very hard that when we finally started to step back up and brush the rust off of us, we decided that we had to work together. So it was labor and corporate, even though we were the place where the battles were fought literally with blood in building out a labor movement, decided they had to work together. It was environment and labor had to work together, and where the Blue-Green Alliance was formed between the Sierra Club and the Steelworkers. It was all of these different forces, Republicans and Democrats, had to work together. We had to work together in order to be able to survive. Mm-hmm. And during that time period as well, we had something that was able to keep our heads above the water, and that was our philanthropic community. Yep. It was the wealth of the Carnegies and the Westinghouse and the Hines and the Mellons and the Hillmans and all of those families that built America. They left their wealth behind for that time when we needed that emergency funding. And during the 80s and the 90s, we didn't sell off all of the gems. In fact, we doubled down on the arts and we built out a cultural district. We built the Warhol Museum. We built a science center. We built amenities into the city at a time when we were going bankrupt. We built parks. We built into a city that had all of this glorious amenities already. And we saved our symphony and we saved our ballet and we saved all those things that a city our size shouldn't have. And so when we finally did come back, we came back as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I'm always amazed about Pittsburgh, obviously your philanthropic community is something that I think all cities would love to have, right? It's an advantage. It gives you an advantage out of the gate, but also just, as someone that studies cities and economic development, your assets that your city has in terms of cultural and recreation and quality of place assets are unparalleled for a city of your size, for sure. And it continues to add to, I think, what makes your city a great place to live. Well, I'd love to do this. I'd love to turn to some policy. Not that we haven't been talking policy, but I'd love to just talk some particular policy questions with you and questions that I've bounced around with some of my students as we knew that we'd have today's time with you. I think one of the things, Mayor, and I'm going to draw some comparisons between what we're seeing here in Texas and otherwise, but Mayor, I think as you watch and read the newspaper around the country, you know that Texas and our governor and our cities don't get along, frankly. It was funny to see our governor yesterday actually tweeting and taking accolades about metro growth, but generally speaking, our cities and mayors and our state officials a lot of times are not what sometimes feels like it's not on the same. We're not playing for the same team. And so one of the things that I think about your city is that you, like us, have that urban and rural divide, particularly in the state of Pennsylvania. I know that well. My husband is from rural Pennsylvania, and so I'm just curious to know, how are you as mayor of Pittsburgh, second largest city in your state, working with state leaders to try to build this shared agenda when you are a lot of times facing headwinds of where an urban and rural maybe collide or conservative and Democrat kind of collide. How are you building a shared agenda between your state leaders and what you're trying to accomplish in the city of Pittsburgh?
Well, first off, I steal a line from one of my favorite mayors, Mayor Adler, which is
He's a great mayor.
We're a blueberry in a sea of tomato soup, and that really does describe Pittsburgh. If you look at electoral map, especially from the last presidential election, it's all red with this one little blueberry, which is Allegheny County, and it's not uncommon, right? You see the same thing in Ohio, you see the same thing in Michigan, you see it in Texas. Metropolitan areas is blue and everything around us is red. And we play a lot of defense. And unfortunately, we play a lot of defense on preemption laws that happen at the state level, which limit the abilities of cities to be able to pass laws that affect our own constituents. We had a victory recently in policy on a law that we passed mandating paid sick leave. And how we were able to win was, in order to pass it, we went all the way to the Supreme Court. And we argued that the ability to protect our constituents outweighs the state's ability to preempt our rights. And the Supreme Court ruled favorably, and in the opinion agreed with us that we do have a right as a home rule charter city to be able to protect our citizens. And that this was even before COVID, that the paid sick rules apply directly to that. Now, that's a great victory for the right of a little blueberry in a sea of red to be able to do so. But again, it's still playing defense. But when you think of it in a greater scale of policy, could this same rule apply to common sense gun reform? Could you make the same argument that you cannot open carry into a Burger King in a metropolitan area an AR-15 because it does not provide you with the same sense of security that maybe it does in a rural setting where you're carrying it in your backyard? And the common sense would argue that in a dense population setting where those types of actions more or less have a negative effect, that it is protecting your citizens. I think it does. And, when you're able to work in that type of a way, you're able to possibly turn what you would be playing defense into playing offense. Mm-hmm. There's a second way, though, too, which is more of a working together. And, it follows more of a policy setting of how can we work in a mutually beneficial way on economic development. And that more follows our Marshall Plan for Middle America. Yep. If we are to be able to meet the necessary goals of the Paris Agreement. Instead of demonizing the fossil fuel industry, which is basically a generational hub of our region, and has been absolutely critical to not only the families of Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky, but also the communities that those industries have built, especially in the more rural areas. How can we benefit them to increase their portfolios, to start to be able to look at clean tech and renewable energy as the necessity of having them survive another 125 years? And how can we get the people in those communities excited about the opportunities of jobs in those sectors? So how can we get a coal miner to become an environmentalist? Put a paycheck in her hand and let her have the opportunity to be a part of that industry. And if we're able to start to work on getting other people involved in the new industry and the new growth, we don't have to utilize tactics of threats, instead utilizing tactics of opportunity in order to be able to build the urban rural partnerships.
So, Mayor, what I'm hearing you basically say is that as you're trying to think about some of those relationships, that economic development argument or that opportunity argument is essential to trying to bridge some of those divides and working with some of your private sector leaders to do this as well. Is that a fair summary of what you maybe are suggesting here?
Very much so. So instead of a Green New Deal that looks towards a socialistic system of creating these large new renewable Tennessee Valley Authority type systems, looking at the businesses that already exist in the fossil fuel industry, that already are transmitting energy, that are already producing energy, and working with them in order to transfer that into renewable and clean tech, and to be able to do it in the regions that are already producing it, to save the towns and villages that are already there in northern Appalachia and the Ohio Valley, and to turn the Ohio Valley into the hydrogen valley, and to be able to employ those miners and those other workers that are already skilled laborers whose families built America once, and to employ them into building America again.
I mean, Mayor, I think what you're describing, particularly around the energy transition, we see that here in Texas, for instance. While maybe perhaps our state leaders are very much still pushing for fossil fuels, and even with our recent winter grid challenges, it was much the scapegoat was on alternative energy. What we are seeing, I think, here, which is fantastic, and if you talk to other mayors, I interviewed several of your cohorts for the Tribune Festival. Well, what they say is that the energy transition is actually happening at the local level, being led in partnership with civic leaders and mayors like yourself, with the private sector leaders. And if it's going to happen, it's going to happen in our cities, in our local communities, and maybe not at that. Maybe we have to push our state and feds to make this happen in a way that becomes maybe more pragmatic, for sure.
Let me add one other point to
please.
this, because the Marshall Plan for Middle America, and it's online, you can read it. It was written through the University of Pittsburgh, the Katz School of Business, but in partnership with the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and also with Columbia University and Jeffrey Sachs. And what it looks at is, what if we do nothing in the 4-state region of Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia? We are set to lose 100,000 jobs in the next 10 years in the energy sector. 40,000 of those jobs are going to come from West Virginia alone, from Senator Manchin's state. If we do not do anything, West Virginia is going to be decimated. If we invest in renewable and clean tech, there will be a net gain of 400,000 jobs. 400,000 in northern Appalachia and the Ohio Valley. And so they're mayors of 9 cities. And these 9 cities are Huntington, West Virginia, Morgantown, West Virginia, Pittsburgh, Athens, Ohio, Youngstown, Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, and Louisville, Kentucky. Guess what they all have in common? A leading research facility, whether it's Marshall University, WVU, Pitt Carnegie Mellon, Youngstown State, Ohio State, Ohio University, Dayton University, University of Cincinnati, University of Louisville. If we're able to work in a combination between innovation, working together with our existing companies, the transference of the industries into new industries around renewable and clean tech are much easier to happen where you already have the infrastructure in place, already have the communities in place, and already have the companies in place than trying to build something new. And I wish that Senator Manchin, I could just sit him down and to let him understand, because the leaders in West Virginia get this.
Right. Yeah, I think you may have saw the New York Times piece this Sunday that was hinting at that he was pushing to remove some of the climate piece of the infrastructure agenda out of the bill. So I want to move on to talking a bit more about sort of the urban renewal and economic development in Pittsburgh, because you guys have done some really interesting things. And you were, Mayor, you were at the forefront. You and your city were at the forefront of embracing autonomous vehicles as a and thinking about that as a platform for the city to really communicate its innovation technology. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you made that bet and where we are on it today and what you see as the future there?
There were a couple of reasons why I was willing to roll the dice. The first of which is a guy named Red Whitaker. And Red was the person who created the robotics program at Carnegie Mellon University many years ago. And in 2007, won the DARPA's robotic challenge and took a autonomous vehicle from Los Angeles to New York. In 2008, began experimenting on the streets of Pittsburgh with an autonomous vehicle. So it wasn't something that was brand new. And I got to know Red over the years and knew of the work that he was doing in one of our neighborhoods called Hazelwood. So when I started to meet with the folks from Uber around 2014, 2015, the early indicators were that they were ready to move to one of about 4 cities, San Francisco, Phoenix, Austin, or Pittsburgh, and to be able to bring up to $2 billion worth of investment in 1,000 jobs. And I didn't want to lose that opportunity. So we were willing to work with them. And, the FAA wasn't created before the airplane. And there was a balance that needed to be made between safety and regulation, but at the same time, innovation does not wait for regulation. And we felt that we could put together at the local level regulation around the innovation, keep the people safe, and be able to land that contract and be able to put Pittsburgh back on the global map for being innovative. It wasn't too long ago that the G20 held its meeting in Pittsburgh in 2008. And when President Obama made that announcement, the White House press corps laughed. And they laughed because it seemed ironic that a meeting of that magnitude would happen in Pittsburgh. At around that same time, there was a joke that was, where do you want to be when the end of the world happens? And it was Pittsburgh, because it's 10 years behind the time. No one tells that joke anymore. And part of ending that joke was being able to have innovative types of activities being brought back to a city that was once before known as the city of innovation.
So, Mayor, the thing that we talk about in my class a lot, and I love teaching at the LBJ student school because our students are fairly passionate about inclusive development. It's the thing that has become core to how we are framing much of the conversation around economic development in my courses now. And I'm curious about how do you balance pursuing these innovative policies, like doing these really experimental things with with Uber and others, and leveraging the technologies that are coming out of CMU and Pitt, with trying to think about how you build opportunity for some of Pittsburgh's maybe more economically distressed areas. I'm thinking about the Hill District and others, for instance. Can you talk about how you're balancing that approach as mayor?
Yeah, I mean, it was part of the discussions with Uber from the very beginning, and part of the part that they never lived to follow through on through their previous leadership. We were talking about creating different types of opportunity for our lowest income areas to have free rides. We wanted to make it part of our smart city challenge to the DOT, part of the challenge that we competed against Austin in. We were looking at creating the first autonomous on-demand system in the world, and we did come through and provide that. But part of that was also to be able to provide free autonomous service for seniors in low income areas of the city to healthcare. And that part never got delivered upon. There were a number of different ways that we were looking to be able to provide mobility options for access to food as a secondary source of part of that partnership as well, and that never happened.
Mhm.
All of those things need to be baked in to the process at the beginning. If there was anything that was learned from that, is that those types of agreements can't be done by a handshake alone.
Yep.
They need to be part of a written agreement that comes with the access to the public right of way. The roads belong to the people, and if that is being given, then the accessibility for mobility for those that are in areas where mobility can create economic mobility need to be put into writing and agreed upon at the very beginning as well.
So, Mayor, you're saying that, and I think it's a really important lesson point for my students who are listening to this call, that you're saying that as we work with our private sector companies to offer them opportunity to help drive economic development, there is the need to formalize community service agreements, perhaps, right? And maybe they have to be more formal, more written, and more accountable going forward as we're thinking about, because frankly, as we now are in a time, as we think about development, inclusive development's at the forefront. Our citizens are expecting us to show quote unquote return on that investment. And so the way to do that is to have some accountability both on the municipal side, but also some accountability perhaps even on the private side as well.
I would say to your students that when you're negotiating, especially with a startup community, remember you're dealing with people who are being funded by VCs, and those VCs have one agenda, and that's their return. And
Yeah.
they're looking at very short runways in order to make money. And so the ideas of social mobility and equity are not in their equation. And if you are looking to be able to assure that that is going to be part of the negotiation, put it in writing at the beginning, and don't make it something that is agreed upon at the beginning, because it will only get pushed to the end.
Yeah, very much so. So, Mayor, I wanted to ask you about one other issue that we're debating. Obviously, all communities are debating this, but in the wake of George Floyd, as you know, as we look across the country, cities are debating how they're thinking about policing in their communities. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your thoughts or perspective on how cities should be thinking about policing now as we move forward, and maybe some thoughts or advice for us as policymakers on that.
Well, I think that last year, with the tragedy that occurred, it was more of a crescendo of decades of what had been made from the lack of looking at reform and basically allowing policing to become more militarized. And I don't think that the solution was or should be defunding or ending policing. Instead, and if you look into the areas where it's the lowest income or where crime is at the highest rates, you'll hear the same voices saying the same things. That they're not looking for less police. What they want is, number one, they don't want to be over policed. They don't want police brutality. And they want to be able to have better services, not just police with weapons. And if you look at places like Germany or Denmark, what you'll see is that psychologists ride with police. This is not a new idea. This is something that has been proven to be highly effective, that the social services should be applied to anything that is not a part of criminal code. So if you're dealing with somebody who is running down the street with their shirt off screaming, that is not a criminal code, and that person needs help. And the place that they don't need to be is in a jail. That is not a place where they're going to get help. So if you're dealing with addiction, if you're dealing with homelessness, if you're dealing with a person who is having issues with mental health, you have to be able to build out a force within your city that has the ability to provide that citizen the help they need. And it doesn't require a gun. And when you respond with somebody with a gun, expect bad things to happen. So as we look at this issue, we have to be able to recognize where the likelihood of a bad situation will occur and how to be able to minimize bad situations from happening. And it doesn't simply mean eliminating policing, because there are a lot of bad things that happen where we do need to have somebody there to be able to protect us and somebody there to be able to make sure that crime is at a minimum. But at that same time, we have to be able to delineate between what is criminal code and what is a social need for people absolutely need help. Mm-hmm. And in those situations, does it really need a gun? And does it really need a police officer? The police officer can get there first and make sure that everyone is safe, but then it has to be followed up with a social worker and with the professional help the person needs.
Mm-hmm. So, Mayor, the thing I'm hearing from you a bit is obviously a rethinking of what policing ecosystem is in our cities. But as I've interviewed Mayor Adler this year, Mayor Turner in Houston, I lost his thought there for a second. Mayor Turner in Houston, Mayor Nirenberg in San Antonio, and even Mayor Parker in Fort Worth, who's new to the gig. The thing that they all talked about is is that there's not a need to defund the police, but actually what you're suggesting is funding more into that ecosystem, not just thinking about more broadly, perhaps.
Yeah, and let me also say this. Every police force around the country for the past 20, 30 years has looked heavily into the military as a recruiting base and have pulled people from the military and actually have given points to veterans in order to apply to become police officers. And when you're in the military, you are trained to be a soldier. And that training doesn't go away when you put on a uniform as a police officer. You're basically a soldier on the street. That's a big difference between being a guardian and being a soldier.
Mhm.
We also noticed that around the country, we have seen much less minority and women who are serving in law enforcement. But if you look around all of our cities, you'll see many, many, many more people serving as security guards. And we're not looking at that career path as a path towards policing.
Mhm.
And many times it's because of the requirement of college education, which remains a barrier for those that serve as security guards to become police officers. But obviously they have an interest in being a person to provide security. We've been talking locally with members of SEIU 32BJ, who are the union members that are representing our security guards all the way from Pittsburgh to New York City, and how we can help to build a career path and to help to get the college credits needed while serving as a police officer. And I think we can not only improve the livelihoods and the careers of these men and women, add to the diversity within the police forces along the East Coast, but also demilitarize our police forces in Philadelphia, New York, and New Jersey, and Pittsburgh.
Yep. So, Mayor, we have a couple questions from the audience. And before we jump into the last section about advice for policymakers, I'd love to just talk about them a bit. So Craig asked a question about inclusive development, and that is, beyond sort of thinking through formal agreements with startups and technology-based companies, what other strategies can cities deploy to promote greater diversity and inclusion in its economic development efforts?
Well, I think it starts early. I mean, you can't just simply do it at the level of a startup being built at the ground level. You really have to start it at the high school level and earlier. We start programs around 7th grade through what we call Rec to Tech, basically utilizing our recreation centers where we have after school programs and sports, and starting in as early as 7th grade and teaching kids coding. And putting them into different opportunities to understand opportunities in technology that their suburban counterparts don't get. We utilize our universities and our corporations as mentors in order to be able to help kids from every single neighborhood. And, the greatest praise that I get from it is the moms who say that their kids get as excited about those classes as they do about football practice. So you started at the earliest levels, then you create career technical assistance programs for the high school level, and you continue it on into programs like we have in Pittsburgh, which is called the Pittsburgh Promise, which is free scholarships for post-high school education for every single public school student in the Pittsburgh public schools for vocational and college education. And then
so, Mayor,
get the kids ready.
Yeah, so you're talking about the key to this, to making sure is early pipeline access, right? I mean, I think that continues to be
has to happen.
Yeah.
What we are missing is pre-K. And that if there's one thing that, I wish that I had done that I didn't do, is provided that, because, it breaks my heart when I read to kids. I pass the book around and I'm sitting there in 2nd grade and I can tell you exactly the kid who can't read. And by the next grade, he's not going to be able to read. And, up until 3rd grade, you learn to read, and after third grade, you read to learn, and he's never going to catch up. And no matter what these programs are that we're going to provide,
Yeah.
you know.
So Mayor, I want to keep going. I've got some great questions from students now that are popping in, and we've just got a few minutes. So Ryan, who's a student of mine, and I know Ryan's kind of an economic development geek, a little bit like me, asked a question, and it's a little bit about incentive deals. And so you maybe have hit on this bit, but I'll ask it as well. His question is, how do you, as mayor, as sort of the chief negotiation officer for your city, avoid getting lost in sort of the shiny objects of a transformational project, and balance that with the idea of making sure that your city's kind of getting the best deal possible, when it comes to maybe a large scale investment from a private firm or an incentive deal. That I point to our class has debated a lot about the Tesla project here in Austin or in Travis County. And there's lots of conversation of could we have done better in the city of Austin, or did we just get shocked by the bright lights that was the brand of Tesla? Any thoughts on that?
It's sort of like making soup. So there's a lot of ingredients in it that you have to basically look at. Part of it's going to be a community engagement. And when I say community, I'm not talking about activists. I mean, that's going to be part of it, but community will be those that will be most impacted, those that will live around where the development will occur, that will have an impact by traffic, that will have an impact by shadow, that will have an impact just because there will be a development that will be occurring that will be different than what they wake up to every single day. In realizing what those impacts will be and doing a SWOT analysis around it. What are the strengths of their neighborhood they don't want to lose? What are the weaknesses in their neighborhood that you can put in there to make sure that they're being mitigated and taken away? What are the opportunities, the things that their neighborhood doesn't have, maybe a grocery store that you're holding that developer to? And what are the threats, the things that they don't want that aren't there now and that you're assuring that won't happen there? Then you have to look at the greater neighborhood. And this is where the activists come in. What's the level of affordability that's being delivered? What is the accessibility and connecting to other parts in the community? What are the environmental impacts of this development? And then once you start looking at those different types of perspectives, you have a different, fuller view of what that development can bring to a greater community and to the immediate neighborhood aspect of that development. And then you sort of negotiate between what the needs of the city are. What is the economic impact on the budget? What will be the long-term effects of that onto the operating budget? What are the needs that will be necessary on the infrastructure, and how will that impact the water and utilities and the other types of effects? And then you just look at the nice, pretty pictures that they give you and you say, does that all fit in with what that type of an image is of the type of city that you want to represent? And does that fit into the uniqueness of the city, or are you simply building anywhere USA?
Yep. So Brendan asked, Mayor, if you have had any initiatives that you have been strongly supportive of, perhaps you've taken them to council or to public support, and they have maybe have not got the support that you were hoping for, or maybe did not get passed. Are there any lessons that you can learn that you can offer from that experience to students who are maybe going to be thinking about this role of policymaking and understanding that there are setbacks and there's wins and there are good days, but there are also bad days perhaps sometimes as well? So not bad days, maybe frustrating days is the way to say it.
Yeah, no, in 30 years of doing this, the amount of opposition has never been so great. And you see it from both the left and the right. I mean, it's just the way the world is right now, and especially in the political realm and in urban planning. And then there are more contrarians than I have ever seen. Then these folks will oppose everything, no matter what it is. If it's out there, their basic role is to find why it is wrong. And you'll provide a great example of urban density along a public transit line that meets LEED Platinum and everything. I check every box, and they'll still find a reason to oppose it. So that is going to exist, and you have to be able to work around that. I'll say this: if you don't start by trying to be able to create a checklist and understanding through sometimes years of listening of what different community needs are, and basically putting that together, you're going to have opposition. You're going to have opposition anyways, but you're going to have more concrete opposition. When you do have opposition, you need to be flexible to be able to try to be able to meet some of the demands. You're never going to be able to meet all of them. And you have to get to a point where you just simply move on. Realizing that you'll never meet every goal has to be the understanding that any urban planner has, because you'll never get to perfection. And then understanding as well that if you are to be in urban planning in a city, that a city is always based on constant change. If it weren't, we would all be living on farmland.
Yeah, that's for sure, Mayor. Well, Mayor Peduto, I really appreciate your time and spending the hour with us. We are at time. It's been a great conversation. We'll share the video. We'll download the video and do all that things that we do here at the LBJ School and get it up on our website and share it with you as well. You can share it with your constituents and groups as well. But it's been a delightful conversation. And thank you for your service to the city of Pittsburgh. I wish you all the best, sir.
Great to see you, Stephen. Take good care,
Take care,
guys.
my friend. Cheers.